Well, good morning, everyone. We are very fortunate and blessed to have a guest speaker today, Patrick Kearney. He's been practicing mindfulness meditation since 1977. He's trained in the insight tradition of Mahasi Sayadaw Burma. He's also studied in the Diamond Sangha with Robert Aitken and Paul Maloney. And he's been teaching mindfulness meditation for over 20 years and doing retreats and seminars. And he also lives off dana that he receives. So if you would like to make a donation, you can through his website. Or if it's easier, you can do it through Twining Vines and we'll pass it on. So thank you so much for being here with us today, Patrick. I'll pass it over to you.
So today I thought we'd have a kind of Zen Theravada fusion. And basically I want to do a commentary on one section of Wu Men's comment on case 1 of the Wu Men Quan. So it's a kind of not quite a teisho, but tackling a Zen subject, but tackling it from an early Buddhist perspective. So perhaps it'll be interesting. So let's begin. Case 1 of the Wu Men Quan. A monk asked Zhao Zhou, "Has the dog Buddha nature or not?" Zhao Zhou said, "Mu." Wu Men's comment. For the practice of Zen, it is imperative that you pass through the barrier set up by the ancestral teachers. For subtle realization, it is of the utmost importance that you cut off the mind road. If you do not pass the barrier of the ancestors, if you do not cut off the mind road, then you are a ghost clinging to bushes and grasses. Of course, you may recognize this as Robert Aitken's translation. And what I want to do today is to actually look at this teaching of cutting off the mind road, focusing in on that particular aspect, basically asking what does it mean and what are the implications for our practice. So basically, if you think about what does it mean to cut off the mind road, well, certainly this revolves around thinking, and particularly thinking in the meditation practice. And why is thinking so important? So if you just ask yourself, when you practice meditation, what prevents you from going deeper into your practice? What blocks your samadhi? For most people, it's thinking. And why does thinking have this effect? Why is thinking so problematic and so important? Well, thinking is important because it represents concept construction. And the concepts that we construct are really important because they construct ourselves. They construct who we deeply think we are, and they construct our world, the world as we conceive it to be. And I think this is part of the image of the mind road. The flow of concept is a road because it leads somewhere. It has a destination. And its destination is the self. In the classic Buddhist sense, the self that stands against the world and suffers. So this is the self of separation and drivenness. So thinking is important because this is where it ends up. So the mind road emerges as the stories that we tell ourselves, the stories that define us. So we imagine ourselves to be a permanent self that survives through time. And this illusion, because for the Buddha it is an illusion, this illusion is fed by our memories, our plans, our anticipations. And of course, we remember through narrative. We plan our future through narrative. We could even say that concepts create time. Without the mind road, there isn't any time. There's not even any present, because the present is just another concept, and it's entirely dependent upon the concepts of past and future. And if there's no concept, there's no self. You could say that in a fundamental sense, we are concept. We are the narratives we tell ourselves. The American philosopher Daniel Dennett wrote, this is a long time ago, late last century, he said, "We don't tell our stories tell us." So he describes the self as the center of narrative gravity, the foundational stories that we come back to again and again and again. And the really weird thing is that these stories we tell ourselves are actually more real to us than the physical world that we inhabit. So I like to give the example of hanging up the clothes. If you've ever hung up clothes on the line, think about it from an observer's perspective, someone watching someone else hanging up the clothes. So what's the activity? Well, it's hanging clothes. But internally, from the actor's perspective, what's the activity? Usually the activity is thinking, creating a reality by telling a story which is more real and more interesting than hanging up the clothes. So the routine physical activity of hanging up the clothes does not grab the attention. And why is that? It's because its narrative power is weak. There's no story in it. Even if its direct sensate feeling aspect is strong. And so this is why thinking is so seductive. Thinking creates meaning. And along with meaning, it creates a self within a world. And this is why, for example, it's so easy in our meditation practice to abandon physical awareness in favor of slipping off into some random dream. Is this making sense? Anybody have any question thus far? Okay, so we shall boldly plough on. So if the mind road creates problems, does this mean that thinking is bad and we should stop? This is a very good meditation instruction. When you become a teacher, you should try it. You have everybody in the meditation hall, and you just stand up and you say, "Don't think, right now." And you look at your watch and you say, "I'll be back in 30 minutes. Make sure you don't think." If this meditation instruction succeeds, the students will be doing very well. Now, this whole question about thinking is addressed by Dogen Zenji in his Zazen Shin, Sharp Edge of Meditation. This is a meditation manual that Dogen wrote, and he talks about thinking using the story of Hong Dao of Yaoshan. Once when great teacher Hong Dao of Yao Shan was sitting, a monk asked him, "What are you thinking as you sit so strongly?" The teacher replied, "I'm thinking, not thinking." How do you think, not thinking? Non-thinking. We'll try to unpack what Hong Dao is talking about. So first of all, we've got thinking and not thinking presented as two extremes. And neither one actually works. So thinking, quote unquote, this is our normal way of life, where we believe in the reality created by the mind road. Not thinking indicates cultivating samadhi, which is so strong that thinking is suppressed. Now, some meditators can do this. They can simply block the thinking through their concentration power because they've got good ability in that area. A lot of people can't do it. But even if we succeed, what do we have? We've got a temporary samadhi state. Sooner or later we come out of it, and as soon as we do, all our delusions and attachments are waiting for us. They're back again. And in fact, this very samadhi and the ability to cultivate it can become fodder for the mind road, because we start to think of ourselves as advanced practitioners who understand more than others. So that's thinking, not thinking, and neither of them work. Non-thinking indicates a new relationship to thinking. And to get a sense of it, we have to backtrack and look once more about why thinking is a problem from the meditator's perspective. So thinking in our meditation practice is bad only to the degree that it interrupts our flow of attention. Only to that degree. Now, the aim of our practice, at least the aim of mindfulness practice, is to attain a continuity of awareness. So awareness remains on its object without interruption. Thinking is a problem when it interrupts this flow of attention. So thinking sucks us into a world of concept that can be maintained only because there is a degree of delusion that sustains it. And the fundamental aspect of this delusion is found in the assumption that the conceptual object presented to the mind is in fact the pure phenomenal object, which it is not. So that's expressing the problem in rather technical language. In plain language, it's just a simple fact that a thought about yesterday is not yesterday. That's essentially what we're saying here. Yet, time has power over us to the degree that we are prepared to believe that our thought about yesterday is yesterday. This is our normal relationship to thinking. If a thought arises and we attend to it as simply a thought arising now, it's not a problem. When we recognize thinking as just thinking, we're not falling into delusion, and we're maintaining an uninterrupted flow of attention on the arisen phenomena. But when we mistake our concepts about what is happening for what is actually happening, then, as Wu Men says, we are like ghosts clinging to bushes and grasses, where the bushes and the grasses represent something extra added to the purity of our lived experience. In other words, we haunt our concepts, unable to escape them. Have you ever had something like an experience where you suddenly remember a past humiliation? Suddenly, you might be meditating, and suddenly some thought pops up, some really painful thought, something that happened in the past. For example, that causes me to feel shame or humiliation. So for some reason, this thought pops up. And as soon as it pops up, my body reacts. So I cringe, or I feel tension in the stomach, or I feel heat in the face. Now, the thing about body is that unlike the mind, body exists only in the present. Body is radically present. This is a fundamental characteristic, and it's one of the reasons why body, some aspect of body, is such a favorite meditation object. To the extent that my awareness is grounded in the body, to that extent, I am grounded in the present. It just naturally follows. And yet in this example, which is a quite common kind of experience, the body is responding to something that occurred in the past, and the past does not exist for it. So why does the body respond? Because the mind convinces the body that this event is actually happening now. It's happening to me, the self who survives through time. That I am the person who underwent that experience all that time ago. So it's convincing the body this is actually happening right now. And if the mind did not have that delusion, the body would not be moved by the memory. It would not respond. It would just be a mental image. Now, the problem here is not the memory, and it's not these associated physical sensations. The problem is the delusion that convinces even the body that what is not happening now, what is not phenomenally real, is happening now, is phenomenally real. And cutting through that delusion is cutting through the mind road. Does that make sense? Any questions thus far? Okay. So let's look at what it means to live on the mind road. The mind road gives us a world of meaning and therefore of names. Now, when we look at the Buddha's analysis of sense experience, when we see, what the eye sees is visible form, and form itself has no meaning. But as I look at you, I don't just see forms, I see you. And you are a name I place on top of what I see. So I don't just see, I read the patterns of forms to create meaning from what I see. And similarly, the ear just hears sounds. But as you listen to me, you are not just hearing sound waves striking the ear. You are naming sounds so that you are perceiving a dharma talk. And then you add concept upon concept. And so you think you're listening to a good dharma talk, or a bad dharma talk, a useful dharma talk, or a useless dharma talk. So our minds take our direct experience and creates meaning from it through the concepts that we put on top of the immediate phenomenal fact. And one term that the Buddha uses when he talks about this is nimitta. This is a Pali and Sanskrit word, which it's a technical term and it gets different translations depending on context. But it's most usually translated as sign. So nimitta, or sign, indicates a label that we add to the immediacy of the experience in order to create meaning. So let's look at an example in our meditation practice, which you may or may not have experienced. Let's say that I'm working very hard on my meditation, and finally I get to the point where I am sitting peacefully with no thought. Has that ever happened to any of you? That's familiar? Now, I don't know, perhaps it's just me, but if this is happening, then suddenly I know that I'm sitting peacefully with no thought. And then what happens? Often, this very peaceful and subtle experience disappears. Bang. Because I've just imposed a concept upon it, a meaning, and I name it in some way. Oh, that's good. The practice is working well. Whoops. Because in naming the experience, I've just separated from it. I've created a duality of me, the practitioner here, having this experience over there, and then putting some kind of value on it, giving it a role in my personal narrative, and then using it to advance the interests of the practitioner, the experience, the experiencer. Have you ever done that? So this is nimitta. This practice of naming or signing or conceptualizing, it may include language. So I might be sub-vocalizing what's happening. But signs and names go deeper than language. For example, if I'm doing kinhin around the zendo, as I'm doing this, I know where I am going. Now, I might be doing kinhin with no thought, quote unquote, but I know where I am going. How do I know this? I'm not thinking about it, but I know it. This is a concept I'm imposing upon the experience. And this concept comes from a place deeper than just thought. And so what we normally call thinking represents a relatively superficial aspect of the meaning-making of the mind. So Dogen Zenji means much more when he says thinking, not thinking, and non-thinking. The meaning-making of the mind goes deeper than what we conventionally call thought. In fact, we could say that as long as an experience means something, then we are caught up in concepts. So these concepts, which Buddha is calling nimitta, the sign, these enable us to read our experience, to discover what it means. So let's say, for example, you're coming to Twining Vines Zen Centre for the first time. And so you're driving there. So how do I find it? Well, I'll put the address into my GPS. So I'm driving along the street. I come to the address, and perhaps, I don't know if there is, but perhaps there's a sign up with the number of the street. And then I think, good, I've made it. Excellent. So I've come to a Zen meeting at Twining Vines Zen Centre. I'm at the address. I know it's the address because there's a sign giving the number of the street. So I stand right beside that number and I wait for other people to arrive. And I'm suddenly getting patient because, we're supposed to start at 10. It's almost 10. There's no one else here. Except I do notice that other people are stopping and walking past me and going into that house over there. I don't know what they're doing over there. Because this is where it is, isn't it? Because it says the number right there. Now, if any of our fellow meditators coming to the Zendo saw us standing beside the number on the post box, completely unable to go any further, they think this person is completely crazy. Maybe they're not ready for meditation yet. Yet, that's exactly how we live most of the time. We mistake sign for what the sign points to. And we live in the world of signs. So whatever that sign, whatever that number, street number is, it's not a Twining Vines Zen, but it points toward Twining Vines Zen. So it cannot be the Zendo, precisely because it points toward the Zendo. So it's very useful, because without that sign, I would be lost. I could never find the Zendo. But I would be equally lost if I stopped at the sign and became upset because no one else was there. So signs are useful, they're even necessary, but if we take the sign to be the reality, if we take the sign to be what the sign points toward, then we're lost in the confusion of the mind road. And from the Buddha's perspective, this is what we do all the time. We're lost in a world created by our concepts because we take the concepts to be real. So the classic example in the Buddha's teaching is, for the Buddha, self is real, but it's real only as a concept. I, quote unquote, am a useful sign pointing toward something. But what's that something that it's pointing towards? As soon as I put a name onto it, I'm back into the sign. So when Dogen says, think non-thinking, he's pointing towards a relationship to experience that is not getting caught up in concepts, that is not mistaking the sign for what the sign is pointing toward. In other words, he's indicating the mind which is cutting through the mind road. So if we're not living in the mind road, what would this be? We're living in what the Buddha calls the at-nimitta, the signless. And this is a world of experience where we recognize that while our seeing, hearing, and thinking are real, are actually present, what we see, what we hear, what we think is not what we think them to be. In other words, our perceptions and judgments are fundamentally wrong. And if we ask, then what is right? As soon as we reach out to put a label on something, to name it as something, what are we doing? We're clinging to certainty, the certainty which is granted only by concept. And as soon as we do that, we're stuck and we're in pain. But when we recognize that our label does not match, when we recognize that our concept is wrong, we can relax back into the gap of uncertainty. And this gap stimulates our curiosity. I don't know. Then what is it, after all? So we are curious. We don't take things for granted, but we stay alert to what's actually unfolding before us. And when we do this, we experience what Dogen calls beginner's mind, where we have cut off the mind road and have dissolved, at least temporarily, the barrier. Okay, done. Dharma Dharma is a word that has multiple layers of meaning. So it can be used to refer to the intellectual structure. So we talk about the Buddha Dharma, the teachings of the Buddha about what's really going on. Fundamentally, Dharma is what's really going on. And what we've been talking about here is that whatever concepts I have about what is really going on is not what is really going on, because they're about. Now, these concepts can be extremely useful. So the Buddha's teaching is full of, it is concepts, it's just full of concepts. But the question is, does the concept help direct me toward what's going on? Now, the meditation practice, that's where I'm trying to get in touch with what is actually going on right now. That's where I'm quite literally practicing that. And of course, once we talk about meditation, there's different techniques that we can use. And different traditions will use different techniques and have different approaches to this. The difference between, you can feel the difference between a concept and a directly experienced event. Basically, in the freshness and directness of the event. Now, if I'll talk about my own background, I'm really interested in thinking in meditation practice because I used to be hopelessly addicted to thinking. My mind would never shut up, never. And so when I would meditate, I would be, working. But it was like everything was wrapped up in thick layers of cling wrap. So I could never actually get to what was really going on. There's always something sticky in the way. And then every now and again, that would fall away. And there it would be, very clear and fresh. I would recognize it and immediately run away from it by sticking a concept on top. So, which is what I was talking about. But once you start, when it happens as an accident. It just happens. Aiken Roshi used to say that realization always comes about as an accident. And the purpose of the meditation practice is to make you accident prone. So it's not that there's a direct cause and effect relationship operating here, but we're working on conditions that somehow click, and there's at least a moment where the clouds go, and this is what's happening. And then bang, we're back into the conceptual world. But what we're doing is we're learning our way to that direct experience. We're learning to recognize it and to stay with it, and to learn to actually prefer it. So the mind or the heart is then inclined toward it. And gradually it becomes part of the furniture of the mind. So then the addiction to thinking subsides, and the experience of a direct relationship to what's going on develops, and things start to come into balance. But it's something that we directly experience. It's not, we can't think our way into it, and we can't technique our way into it. It's basic. I think the main thing is developing this sense of curiosity, of not taking anything for granted. So much of meditation is really mundane. Okay, I want you to focus on your breathing. In breath, out breath. Breathing in, breathing out, breathing in, breathing out, breathing in. And it gets really boring and tedious. But if there's a curiosity about what's going on, like how do I know that I'm breathing? What is this? What's going on? If there's that curiosity, that sense of investigation, then there's a much better chance of actually breaking through into the direct experience. I think in the Zen tradition, where they use koans, they're deliberately cultivating that sense of investigation and curiosity and kind of focusing it in the hopes that if it works, it's like, oh, I've just directly experienced something. Women, we selected one brief part of women's comment. So you have the case itself, which is very, very small. And then you have the comment. And women is actually explaining a lot. In fact, he's being more explanatory in this comment than he is anywhere else in the book. So we're just zeroing in on one part of his commentary. If you're going to do this, you have to cut off the mind road. Now, there's different ways of looking at what he's talking about here. One way is to say, well, cutting off the mind road is the realization. But another way of looking at it is it's part of the path to realization. It's rather similar to the way the Buddha talks about nimitta. He would talk about nimitta, and then he talks about the opposite, the animitta, the signless. And sometimes he'll talk about the signless samadhi, and sometimes he'll talk about the signless liberation. So the signless samadhi is a practice. There's something I can actually do. And the signless liberation is the direct experience. I don't do it, it just happens. And I think the same ambiguity is there with women when he talks about cutting off the mind road. On the one hand, he's pointing to a practice. He's giving a hint. This is what you should be working on in your practice. But at the same time, he's also saying, when it clicks, that's what you're going to experience. So we've been talking about both sides of this, but basically kind of outlining the problem. Like, what's the territory that he's interested in? What's he actually talking about? So it's. I think it's what I'm trying to do is to get a sense of when Wumen says cut off the mind road. I mean, it sounds nice, and I listened to this for years when I was in Hawaii with Aiken Roshi, but I never knew what it meant. Except, is he saying you've got to stop thinking? And finally I realized, no, it's much more deep than that. There's much, much more to it than that. It's not simply about don't think. And he's not demonizing thinking. He's doing something else.
Well, I'll ask a question. Could you say a few words about the tendency people have to judge their meditation, whether it's about the quality of the thoughts or how much they're thinking, or how engaged they get with it? Just some guidance to maybe help people break that tendency to judge.
That's a major problem with meditation practice, because let's say that we find ourselves oppressed by our concepts in one form or another. So we come to meditation practice in order to work our way through this. But of course, when we arrive with a whole pile of concepts. So I have a concept about what meditation is. I have a concept of what's supposed to happen when I meditate. I have a concept of what the result will be. And some of these concepts come from my reading. Some of them come from my meditator friends. Some of them come from what the teacher says. So I'm sitting there, and I'm in this jungle of concepts. And the thing is that in this particular instance, I mean, even without going into the esoteric Dogen Zenji stuff, I can be absolutely confident that all of my concepts are completely wrong, because I don't know anything about meditation. I've only just begun. And yet I think I know what's supposed to happen, and I don't. So this is a very common problem, and it comes out with the problem of progress. One of my main teachers was a man called John Hale, and he once was quietly gossiping about a mutual friend who he was teaching. And this particular friend was very judgmental and very critical of everyone, including himself, all of the time. And he comes in to interview in a meditation retreat, and he starts complaining. He says, "I'm not making any progress. I'm working so hard and I'm not making any progress." And John's response was to ask the simple question, "How would you know?" And it wasn't a rhetorical question. It was quite genuine. Like, you're new at meditation. How do you know what's supposed to happen? You don't know. And yet we're determined to act as if we know. A classic one is, in a retreat situation, someone will come into an interview and complain, "Oh, look, I knew I thought a lot, but in the days since I've been here, I'm thinking even more. So my practice is failing. It's completely hopeless." And I say, well, yeah, maybe. Or maybe your mind is becoming much more sensitive to what's happening, and so you're seeing your thinking process much more clearly. Maybe it's a sign of progress. But what happens in meditation practice is so counterintuitive, especially for people who are relatively new or simply don't understand the process very much, that it is ridiculously easy to misinterpret what's going on. And so we make these judgments and we don't realize that these are just expressions of the same delusions that brought us here in the first place. And this is why judgments about meditation practice can be so sticky and even destructive. Now, there's also discernment about what's happening in the meditation process. And that discernment is really useful, but it develops slowly over time. Meditation is a craft. We've got to learn the craft. And as we learn it, then we can begin to figure out what's really going on. But the tendency to jump in and start making judgments based upon our profound ignorance is very tempting, and a lot of people do it, and they just mess themselves up in the process. I don't know if that really addresses what you're asking.
Yes, thank you so much. I like the distinguishing between judgment and discernment. That seems very, very beneficial.
Now, the Buddha, when the Buddha talks about mindfulness, the Pali word is sati, and sometimes he uses the compound sati sampajanya. Sampajanya means clear understanding. So mindfulness and clear understanding, but all one word as a compound. So indicating how closely interconnected they are. As the mindfulness develops, the discernment, the understanding, the wisdom develops, and they go hand in hand. And that discernment is absolutely central. This is why mindfulness is a wisdom practice. We might talk about that some other time.
Well, thank you so much.